right, turn to Proverbs 10:5. This is continuing the thought of Proverbs 10 and verse 4. Proverbs 10 and verse 5 says, "He that gathereth in summer is a wise son, but he that sleepeth in harvest is a son that causeth shame." So this verse has both a literal and a figurative application in our lives. The literal one is obvious, talking about farming. So we'll look at that one first. He that gathereth in summer is a wise son. So in a literal sense, summer is the season of the year in which crops that were planted in the springtime begin to ripen and you can start to pick them and harvest them. A wise son of God, or a wise son in general, but a wise son of God, will begin gathering the fruits which he planted in the spring as soon as they're ripe in the summer. That just makes sense, right? Wise is having or exercising sound judgment or discernment, capable of judging truly concerning what is right or fitting, and disposed to act accordingly, having the ability to perceive and adopt the best means for accomplishing an end, characterized by good sense and prudence, opposed to foolish. So clearly a man with good judgment, when the fruit starts to come ripe, he's going to pick it, right? He's going to start gathering in the summer. He's not going to waste what he's put time into already. He's going to let nothing go to waste. He's not going to let it rot on the vine. And we already looked at these verses about the slothful man roasteth not that which he took in hunting, and he that is slothful in his business is brother to him that is a great waster. He's not going to waste. You know, Jesus, when he created bread out of nothing, when he turned the 5 loaves into enough bread to feed 5,000 people, afterward, even though it was bread that he made himself by his own divine power, he said, gather it up. He didn't want anything to be wasted. John 6 and verse 12 says, when they were filled, he said unto his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. And this is why it's a passion of mine to not waste food. If Jesus Christ created the food and he wasn't going to waste it and told his disciples not to, then I don't think we should either. Now, I'm not saying you should eat rotten stuff. And I'm also not saying if somebody gives you something that you didn't ask for, you are not obligated to eat it. You go to a cookout and somebody's got 3 dozen hot dog buns that they didn't use and say, oh, here, you can have these. Yeah, and what am I going to do with those? So anyway, they just don't want to feel bad for wasting themselves, so they're going to put it on you. So a wise man works hard when it's time to work. This is what this verse is telling us. Those who have gardens should be ready to put in the work of harvesting their produce as soon as it begins to ripen. That's what a wise son does. And we should learn from the ants and be wise and gather in the summer. That's what they do. Amazing what we can learn from these little creatures that have brains the size of pinheads. Proverbs 6 through 8. Ants have brains the size of pinheads. A lot of Americans are just pinheads.
I know that Americans have more than that.
Yeah. Proverbs 6 through 8. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler. Nobody's telling this little ant what to do. She's just doing it. Provideth her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. Now there's also a figurative application here. In a figurative sense, summer is the season of life in which the effort of a young man that he put into education and training and working his way up the corporate ladder, it begins to pay off. Right? Springtime of life, you're young, you're growing up, you go and you get your education, you get some training, you get your first job, you start learning a skill and applying yourself, and you start to grow in your career a bit. That's the springtime of your life. The summer is when that starts to pay off. And now, all of a sudden, things are going better, and you're getting paid more, and you have more capability. There's more fruit to collect. A wise son of God will not slack off and leave opportunities on the table during his summer of life. Summer of life is basically middle age. That would be about summer of life. And people define middle age by 45 to 65. That's the summer of life, basically. That's when you're really growing your career, you're doing well in your career during those years. It's funny, I was reading a description of middle age, and they were going off point by point. And I thought, by that definition, I've been middle-aged since I was 25. Like, not understanding what the kids are talking about, wanting to go to bed early, not running around being an idiot, not being trendy and cool and whatever, being serious and focused on life and thinking about your age and your mortality and all those kind of things. I'm like, man, I've been middle-aged for 15 years. But anyway, where was I? Oh, yeah. He will not turn down promotions or advancements due to laziness or fear, which would be best for him and his family. Remember the slothful man says there's a lion in the way, a lion's in the street, right? He's lazy. He's using his fear as an excuse. Jesus taught in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25 through 26. You remember the man that hid the talent in the earth? He said, I was afraid. I know you're a hard man. And he says, thou wicked and slothful servant. He cut right through the nonsense and realized what it was. He was lazy. Okay? But the man, a wise man, in the summer of his life, right, in that middle age, he's not going to turn down advancements and promotions if they're best for him and his family. Now, they may take him away from his family. He may have to travel. He may, that wouldn't be wise. But if he could do so and do better for his family, he's not going to turn those down because he's lazy or scared. He will not turn down a moderate amount of overtime, which would allow him to save more money to get ahead. A moderate amount. Not 60 or 70 hours a week, but a little bit of overtime. He's not going to turn that down in the summer of life because it's important to save during those years. And now we get to the second part of the verse. But he that sleepeth in harvest is a son that causeth shame. Again, we have a literal sense and a figurative sense. So in the literal sense, harvest is the season of the year in which the majority of the crops that you planted in the spring and that you worked at and weeded and took care of in the summertime, now they're ripe to be harvested. Harvest is the third of the 4 seasons of the year, the autumn, the season for reaping and gathering in the ripened grain. This is the time of year when it's most crucial to work to reap the benefit of the labor which was expended during planting in spring and weeding and watering in summer. In summer, you get to gather a little bit, right? In middle age, you're gathering a little bit. I'm getting ahead of myself. But in summer, you're gathering a little bit. In harvest, that's when you gather big time. Like that's when all the work you put in that garden, in that field, that's when it all starts coming in. And that's when you can really start collecting on the work that you've put in all year long. A son of God who sleeps during harvest and lets the food he worked hard for go to waste is a son that causes shame. Shame is the painful emotion arising from the consciousness of something dishonoring, ridiculous, or indecorous in one's own conduct or circumstances, or in those of others whose honor or disgrace one regards as one's own. Your children, your brother, your wife, your husband, they can bring you to shame too. If you basically consider their honor as your own and they do something shameful, it's going to make you feel ashamed. Or of being in a situation which offends one's sense of modesty or decency. So the son who sleeps during the harvest causes dishonor and shame. You think about it. Any person who would plant a garden or a field and then sleep while it should be harvested and waste all that God has blessed him with is indeed a person who deserves dishonor and disgrace. Can you imagine? Planting a field, planting a garden, and then comes the harvest, and it just sits out there and rots. You're just sleeping. Think about that. That would definitely cause shame, would it not? Once again, we should learn from the ants and be wise and gather in the harvest. We already read that verse in Proverbs 6 and verses 6 through 8. Those who have gardens should be ready to labor diligently in the fall in order to gather and preserve as much of their produce as possible. This is not the time to be sleeping, right? This is the time to be working. If you want to sleep, you got to sleep, take your nap earlier. Now, in a figurative sense, harvest is the season of life in which the effort of a lifetime of labor and diligence produces maximum income. It's that period right before the winter of life when a man can no longer work. That's the harvest of life. It's that period after middle age, but before you can't work, where you're totally incapable of it. You're old, elderly, you can't even walk around. I mean, you're just half dead, just lying there waiting for life to be over. It is the time, the harvest of life, is the time in a man's career when he's at the peak, when he's at his peak and he's earning the most money of his life. Just like the garden. Come harvest time, I mean, there is an abundance, and all you got to do is pick it. You put in all the work all year long, and now it's time to just pick it. It's there. It's the same with the guy in the harvest of life. It's there. I mean, you're making more money than ever. It's just, all you got to do is just show up and just get it. You put in all that work to get there. This is the time of life when the most money can be earned and saved for the coming winter of life. And just as the son who sleeps during the literal harvest causes shame, so does the Son of God who figuratively sleeps during the harvest time of life. You got to make hay while the sun shines. You know, Jesus taught that it's important to work while it's day because the night cometh when no man can work. And I tell myself this, I know I'm not even 40 years old yet, but I think about this verse often. I've got to work while it's day. The night's coming when no man can work. There's going to come a day, and it'll come faster than I realize, when I will be incapable of working. I'll be some drooling, pathetic old man, not able to do anything. And I've got to work while I can work, and I want to work until I can't work anymore. John chapter 9 and verse 4. John 9:4. I must work the works of him that sent me, Jesus said, while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. Now, we got a problem in this country. Millions of Americans have been sleeping during harvest for the last generation or two. This is a common problem. The American dream for many has been to retire as soon as possible and spend the rest of their life playing and enjoying leisure. That's the American dream. That's what most people look forward to their whole lives, retiring as early as possible, some people, in their 50s, whatever they can get away with, and playing. Florida's full of people like this. I see them all the time when I go down there. Full of people that are just playing. They may spend the last 20 years of their life just playing. Many of these people were able to get away with living beyond their means and saving very little for their entire lives because they trusted that pensions and Social Security were going to provide for them in their old age. Now, most pension plans are insolvent. State pension plans, a lot of the states, their pension plans are in terrible shape. Most companies don't even have them anymore because they were totally financially untenable. So pensions are going the way of the dinosaur, and people that are relying on them are probably going to be in some trouble. The Social Security system is insolvent itself. If the Social Security checks continue to be sent in the future, they will buy less and less because they won't keep up with inflation. Now, I've been warning about this for years, but now the last year has vindicated me. Like since 2014, I've been warning about this is coming. And in 2021, all of a sudden, inflation finally caught up with us. People thought that, people like Peter Schiff and people that have been warning about this for a long time, they all thought he was nuts. Well, he wasn't nuts. It just took a while for all the money that was created to filter through the system. Last year, 2021, the effects of all the government spending and money printing, which facilitates it, finally began to show up in significantly higher consumer prices. For a long time, we had fairly low inflation, but now all of a sudden, things are really taking off. The CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, which is how the government measures inflation, rising prices in other words, the CPI was 7% in 2021, which means that according to the government, prices went up by 7%, which was the highest level in 40 years. Now, 40 years ago, they measured inflation differently than they do now. This is the highest inflation we've ever had in this country, well, except for the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. They measure inflation differently now. They changed the CPI calculation in the 1980s so that it would understate inflation, which would allow them to give smaller cost of living increases to Social Security recipients, and other things too. It also helps with the GDP, because inflation subtracts from the GDP. Whatever inflation is subtracts from it, because if prices are just rising and there's not more output, it makes the gross domestic product look larger, but it's really not larger. It's just prices are higher. So whatever the inflation number is subtracts from the gross domestic product. So if they can make the inflation number lower, it makes the gross domestic product look bigger. So it looks like the economy is doing better if they can keep the inflation number lower, and they have to pay out less for cost of living increases. The government always wants inflation to be low, to be lower than it is. So they change the way that they figure it, and that's another story for another time. This means that Social Security payments increase at a slower rate than prices are rising. This means that that income in real terms of Social Security recipients is decreasing every year. Even though you got a 7% increase last year, prices were up 15%. That's what the real level of inflation last year was, about 15%. And there are people that calculate it like they used to. John Williams at Shadow Stats calculates it. If you calculated it like they did in the 1970s, inflation is 15%. Social Security recipients get 7%, so you've actually lost 8%. Your income has gone down 8%, not up 7%.
From the perspective of somebody that does price changes in a retail place, the 15% is closer to right for last year, and this year's going to be even higher.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's not. It is. I do not think it's going to slow down at all. So there's no reason to believe, that was the next point, that inflation is going to come back down, but will more than likely continue to rise every year due to more and more money printing. So it won't be long, I do think, until those who have been sleeping in harvest are going to wake up in the dead of winter and realize that the shelves are bare. And at that point, they're going to have to go back to work. Not because they want to, but because they have to. And this has been happening for a long time, as I'll mention here in a second. At that point, the American dream, so-called, is over. And it's going to be time to get back to reality. And like I said, this has been happening for years. 10 years ago, when I was working at an engineering firm, we had old guys, 2 of them I remember in particular, old guys coming back to work, not because they wanted to, because they had to. They were on fixed income, whatever, their investments weren't panning out, interest rates are really low, and it's just wasn't keeping up. They're coming back to work. At the bus barn, it was the same thing. One of the drivers, he had retired, Social Security wasn't cutting it. He's back driving a bus. Not because he wanted to. The last thing he wanted to do is drive a bunch of brats around, because he had to. There was a lady there, too. She was a monitor. Same thing, old lady, probably early 70s. She's back working, not because she wanted to, because she had to. And I think there are going to be a lot of people in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s coming back into the labor force, competing with younger people for jobs. And this has been happening for years, for a lot of years, the last number of years. The majority of people that were coming into the labor force were people in their older years, 50s and 60s. It wasn't the young people. And I believe this is the reason for it. And that was before we had all this inflation. The thing is, they're probably not likely going to get the high-paying jobs that they had when they retired, but they're going to have to settle for much less desirable jobs due to their advanced age and diminished abilities. I mean, you think about it. You've been out of the labor force for 10 years, and you're 75 years old or whatever. You're not going to go back and get the job you had. More than likely, you've forgotten all that stuff. Not to mention you're old and you can't, you just can't think like you used to, or can't work physically like you used to. If they'd have been like